Do you sometimes find yourself remaining silent, even when you know you should speak up? Well, you're not alone. During our lives, many experiences have taught us to be silent, and consciously or unconsciously, we've learned to censor ourselves. But it doesn't have to be that way. Stay tuned, I'll talk with Elaine Lin Hering about Unlearning Silence, how to speak your mind, unleash talent, and live more fully. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Elaine Lin Hering is a facilitator, speaker, and writer. She's worked with mental health professionals, political officials, religious communities, and leaders of major companies to build skills in communication, collaboration, and conflict management. Elaine, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, tell me about what you observed in your work as a facilitator that led you to want to write this book.
I spent more than a decade facilitating leadership development workshops on skills for negotiating, having difficult conversations, and receiving feedback. And even though the tools and frameworks that my colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Project created, I believe, are sound, I noticed that some people, even after that incredible investment, still didn't negotiate, still didn't have the difficult conversations, and still wouldn't give or receive feedback no matter how much HR or their manager encouraged them to do so. And so I wondered, why is that?
It seems that a lot of us deal with this. So I imagine that your audience for this book could be very wide. And people could use this not only in business and just professional, ways, but also in interpersonal relationships as well.
Absolutely. That is one of the struggles of the book. Books aren't supposed to be for everyone if you talk to people in publishing. And so this started out as a business book, as a leadership book, because that's the world that I come from. And yet when I think about families, when I think about communities, when I think about neighbors, how many of us don't actually say what we really think to the very people we live with or that we love? And in that silence, we're not seen, known, or heard. It's actually not possible to have intimacy with your spouse or your partner or your family members if you feel like you have to be silent or that you are silenced by them.
Well, I want to talk about some of the specific observations and advice that you offer in the book in just a moment, but give us a brief overview. What are readers going to find here?
Yeah, readers are going to find an invitation to examine their own relationship with silence. Too often when it comes to speaking up or negotiating, we're told to just do it, as if it were a Nike advertisement. And those of us who then are not successful in getting the outcomes that we want, the promotions at work, internalize the message of, oh, it must be me. I'm the problem. If I had more courage, if I had more confidence, if I used these words instead of those words, then I would be seen and heard. And my observation is that's part of it, and there are certainly leverage points there. But part of why we don't speak up is because we've learned and been rewarded for silence. That from the way that we grew up to the different life experiences we've had, we've learned and been rewarded for not rocking the boat, for keeping our thoughts to ourselves, to keeping the peace. And of course, because we're all different, but we tend to assume that people are like us, we end up silencing the very people we lead and that we love. And so the book is trying to answer that question in a more nuanced way and in a more actionable way. That if we're really trying to build a culture of voice where people are accepted and respected, it is both about my unlearning the ways I silence myself and acknowledging and changing the ways that I might be silencing other people.
Let's talk a little bit about the downsides here, beyond just the personal, but how not getting the input from an employee for maybe a spouse or family member actually hurts more than just the person, that you're losing a lot of important information that might make those relationships better or might create better businesses.
Absolutely. I mean, we can look to current events right now. I won't name names in the airline industry, but that is one that comes to mind, that if our choices are to speak up but we're not heard, or to have to stay silent, then we end up as teams falling prey to groupthink. And as leaders, we end up living in a skewed sense of reality because we're not getting the insight and input from our teams that we need. So one element is, do we have accurate and complete data on which to make good decisions for our businesses and our communities? The second aspect is a physical health perspective, not even to get to mental health, but we can thank our Surgeon General and many other researchers for this research on the epidemic of loneliness. The less that we are talking about things, the more we think and believe it's just me. I'm the problem. And we are further isolated. And that, of course, leads to health impacts, cardiovascular issues, shortening of life. Those health impacts have been comparable to obesity or to cancer over time. So really thinking about what can we do to be healthier and more whole together, which is the subtitle of the book, Live More Fully. It is certainly about data, but it is also about connection and accuracy in information.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about what we can do individually to make our voices heard, to feel more confident about speaking out. But first of all, let's talk about what you mean by silence. That can take many different forms.
Absolutely. And this is in the introduction of the book. I am pro silence in terms of the pause between stimulus and response, right? Silence is a core to meditation and intentionality. The silence I'm talking about is the shadow side of silence, when there's not enough room in the conversation for your thoughts, or a prerequisite to staying in the relationship seems to be that you don't say anything but what people want to hear. Silence is when you're not invited to the meeting and you didn't think you could ask. And of course, that becomes internalized in the self-doubt, the imposter syndrome, the I'm the problem, rather than we all have a relationship with silence and together we need to solve for this external thing that we've often internalized called silence.
So tell us about how we overcome this. And I should also note that in your book, you have questions for reflections and your turn sections. So I'm sure that's all part of working through this and helping us on an individual level learn how to express ourselves.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that unlearning silence can be a daunting ask. And I try to write with as much compassion as possible, knowing from my lived experience in coaching others how challenging this can be. Fundamentally, we're asking and inviting ourselves to behavior change, which for anyone who has ever tried to lose weight, we know the uphill battle that can be. But it is also the opportunity to bring forth those ideas, to have greater understanding in our relationships and to be more whole. So how do we actually unlearn silence? I would say slowly and step by step. And of course, the book breaks that down to specific invitations. One would be a stance of experimentation, that you're not just leaving after listening to this, going to your manager and telling them everything that you think is wrong with them. So much as what might be a low risk experiment where you can try on, what is my voice? What is something I think? And often it's great to do those test cases on strangers, because it's not like you have to go home and live with them or be married to them for the rest of your life. So is that the barista at the coffee shop gets your order wrong, and instead of sucking it up and just taking the drink, actually saying, well, this is what I ordered, and see what happens? Because oftentimes the reaction is more positive or open than our lizard brains make it out to be. The second place I would start is an internal place, which is to ask two simple questions. As you're listening to a podcast, as you're reading an article, as you're sitting in a meeting at work, what do I think? And what do I need? Many of us have been acculturated to think about what everybody else wants, or to solve for what would my manager do? What line does leadership want me to hold? Rather than thinking, what do I think or need in the moment? That's not to say that we're not going to consider what other people might need or think, but that we ourselves will have unique perspectives on whatever is going on, and that those perspectives are actually valuable.
I'm talking with Elaine Lin Hering about Unlearning Silence, how to speak your mind, unleash talent, and live more fully. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you appreciate this discussion, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll know when I post new interviews with authors. And thank you. Now, a lot of people will be reluctant to take that first step. But is this like a lot of things in life that the more you do it, the easier it'll become? You'll gain more confidence?
Completely. There is a story in the book of one of my experiments, landing in Seattle, getting in a taxi cab, and really wrestling with whether to ask the taxi driver to open the window because I think child lock was on. I couldn't get the window to open myself. And it was about a 20-minute debate in my head that ended up with an experiment of saying, "Sir, could you open the window?" And he didn't say anything back. He just pressed a button. And it was the most glorious fresh air I have ever breathed. So yes, it is experimentation over time, including starting from wherever you're at. Many of us are comfortable speaking up on behalf of other people and less so on behalf of ourselves. Or some of us are very comfortable at home, but not at work. Some of us, because of our lived experiences, it's across the board. So really starting with where are you at? And even thinking about the value proposition of why. It's not just speaking up for speaking up's sake, but so that you can get what you need, so that you can contribute, so that you can spend the energy that we currently use editing ourselves to contributing and fundamentally being able to live more aligned in a life that you want to live.
Another thing that you have to take into consideration is the situation you're in, because there are times when silence is appropriate because it might make things worse or might put you in danger. So, yes, we should speak up more often, but do it when it's appropriate.
Absolutely. So chapter 3 is one of my favorite chapters of the book, which is when silence makes sense. Often the advice around speaking up is, well, do it, as we discussed earlier. And to me, unlearning silence is not about saying everything all the time to everyone. The world is too noisy and too complex for that. So much as, when do you choose to speak? Is your silence strategic? Is it chosen or is it imposed upon you? The difference between silence that is additive or generative is agency. Do I get to choose when I want to use my voice? And that makes all the difference.
Another aspect of this that we touched on earlier is whether we're conscious of it or not, we may be causing other people to be silent when we really want their input. Yeah. So what are some of the ways that we perhaps unconsciously tell people we want them to be silent when that's not really the message we want to deliver?
Absolutely. And for any listeners who are cringing and getting defensive, saying, well, that's not me, let's all take a deep breath together. My hypothesis that I'll put to all of us is that if we are human, we end up silencing each other, even and especially when we don't intend. And the way that we can rectify that, reconcile that, is to be aware of the ways that we might be doing it. So number one, and in the book, I list out 9 different ways that we might silence other people, but we'll go to 2 today. The first is failing to recognize how hard it is for someone to speak up. Oftentimes you hear well-intentioned leaders saying, tell me what you really think. My door's always open. And I've had the extreme privilege of doing diagnostic calls with those direct reports of those leaders who say, yeah, I could never do that. I know how things go. Or I've watched other people try that and they are no longer here. And so we forget, power is invisible to those who have it. So we often forget how we might be perceived. We forget what it's like to be more junior. We forget how challenging it could be if that has not been our own challenge that we faced. Second is that we require people to speak in the ways that make it easiest for us to listen. So in corporate America, oftentimes the communication style of 3 succinct bullet points, no ums, just the right amount of emotion to show that you care, but not too much that you would lose credibility, is the prerequisite to being heard. If you don't speak that way, if you're not wired that way, then you don't have executive presence and you're not leadership material. And if that is the requirement, we miss out on the brilliant insights from people who might communicate more effectively asynchronously, who might be post-processors, who their keen ideas come up in their brains 20 minutes after the meeting, and who are more comfortable typing than talking in real time. So how can we design our communication flows to optimize for voice, to capture those insights, rather than perpetuating the barrier to entry to the conversation by requiring that people communicate to us in the ways that we're used to, or that might be easiest for us?
Now, there's much more in this book that we won't have time to talk about. So what would you say are a few of the key concepts that you hope people are going to take from it?
Yeah, the title really captures most of it for people who are looking for a Cliff Notes version. One, that there is this thing called silence. It impacts us. If you're not aware of the role that plays in your life and on your teams, then it is likely undercutting your team or your family's effectiveness. Second, that we have all learned silence, and that means that we can unlearn it. It might be a slow, arduous, and at times awkward journey, but in it is the opportunity for leaders to show up in more alignment with how most leaders say they want to show up. I want to support my people. I want to bring out their talent, rather than the negative impacts that we often unintentionally have. And last, the book is Unlearning Silence rather than Unlearn or I've Unlearned Silence, because it is an ongoing journey. If this is about how we all impact one another and the world that we co-create, it is going to be an ongoing journey for us. And my hope and invitation is that each of us shows up with intentionality going forward to use our voices and create a world in which each of us is respected, experiences belonging and dignity.
To learn more, the book is Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully by Elaine Lin Hering. Elaine, thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
If you'd like to purchase Unlearning Silence, I placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.